Today's video is a collection of 5 fan-favorite stories that each sparked years of theories, speculation, and debate online. Now, these 5 fan favorites have all been completely re-edited for today's episode, so even if you may have heard or seen some of them before, it will still feel like a brand new viewing experience. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Around 7:20 p.m. on the evening of December 11th, 2002, a police department in a rural English county called Surrey started receiving all these frantic emergency calls. Now, all of these calls were coming from drivers on a heavily trafficked highway called the A3, and they all were saying the same things. They had seen this totally reckless driver with super bright headlights that was weaving in and out of traffic and going at high speeds and nearly crashing into people. And then a couple of the callers said they actually saw this car go down the embankment off the side of the highway, and so it looked like they might have crashed. And so, of course, this police department, after getting all these calls, decided to send out a couple of officers to see what was going on. When the 2 officers got out to the A3 and began patrolling the area on the A3 where all these calls were saying they had seen this reckless driver, they didn't see the driver. They didn't see a wreck on the side of the road. They didn't see any signs of an accident. I mean, there was nothing there. Now, had only one person called in about this wild, reckless driver, at this point, the officers would have chalked this up to a mistake or even a prank. But so many people called in about this one particular reckless driver on the A3 that these 2 officers decided to just keep on looking and really see if they can figure out where this driver went. And so to this point, the 2 police officers had been just driving on the A3 to try to find this driver. And so they decided they would park their vehicle, get out, and walk on foot on the edge of the highway because there were these huge forests that lined either side of the A3. In fact, Surrey, the county in England where this was one of the most heavily forested areas in all of England. And so these forests on either side of the A3 were very dense. You could not see very far into them. And so these officers were thinking that it might be possible that this driver, if they were driving as recklessly as all the callers made it seem like, they could have veered off the highway, gone down the embankment, and then because they were going at such a high speed, they could have crashed their way into one of these forests and basically disappeared from view from the road. That in order to see this crash in the forest, you'd have to be basically in the forest. And so these 2 officers, they pulled over, they got out, and they began walking along the edge of the highway, staring into the forest, looking for a sign of a car wreck. And sure enough, after walking for a while, one of the officers spotted something deep in the woods that looked almost metallic or plastic. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be in the forest. And so the officers made their way into the tree line and began walking through all the trees. And as they got closer, they realized very clearly there was a car. There was a wreck in the forest. And so the 2 officers, they begin running towards the wreck. They're calling for backup on the radio. They get to this wreck in the middle of the forest, and they're on the driver's side, and they look inside the car, and there's no driver in the driver's seat, but they looked through the car to the passenger side, and they saw the front passenger door was wide open, and on the ground on the other side of the car was very clearly a body. And so the 2 police officers rushed around the car to get a better look at the body. And when they did, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It didn't make any sense. Like, what was this? Now, to understand why these police officers were so caught off guard by what they were seeing, we need to go back 5 months to July 16th, 2002. On that night, a 21-year-old man named Christopher Brian Chandler finished up his beer at a pub in West London. And for reference, where this pub was located was about 1 hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey where the car was found in the woods. This night, Christopher had gone to this pub with a close friend of his. This was meant to be a fun night out. But, as Chris is finishing up this beer, he began to feel really antsy because it turned out Christopher was actually wanted by police in London for robbery, and so he hated staying in one place for too long. And so the only people who even knew where Christopher was the friend he was with at the bar, and then also Christopher's brother. He knew he was at this particular pub. And so finally, Christopher got so anxious about being in this pub for too long that he told the friend he was with that he just wanted to leave. And so he said goodnight to his friend. The friend stayed at the pub, and Christopher left, got in his car, and began driving south. But Christopher never arrived at the place he was trying to go. He just sort of disappeared, and nobody heard from him again. Christopher's brother eventually would report Christopher missing, but remember, the brother knows Christopher is wanted for robbery, and so Christopher suddenly going on the lam and just disappearing for a while was kind of par for the course, and so the brother really didn't think this was a big deal. And also, the police felt the same way because they know Christopher is trying to elude them, and so it makes sense he would be missing. And so as a result, nobody really followed up on Christopher's missing person report. Everybody just kind of moved on. That is, until 5 months later, when all those drivers began calling into the police in Surrey about seeing this totally reckless driver careening down the A3, who eventually crashed into a ditch. And then those two officers, they went out to that stretch of A3, and sure enough, it was Christopher's car, and the body on the ground was Christopher. However, there was a problem. When the two police officers walked up on Christopher's car and saw it for the first time, they were struck by how old it looked. But it didn't really register with them why that would matter. It just stood out to them that this is a really, really old and rusted up car. But when they went around to look at the body on the ground, Christopher's body, they saw that his body was actually mostly a skeleton, which meant Christopher did not crash and die on this night, December 11th, 2002. Very likely, he crashed and died 5 months earlier, right around the time he disappeared. Now, the Surrey police, they say that this was all just one big coincidence, that the reckless driver that all these drivers were reporting that night on the A3 must have not crashed and actually just kind of got away, and then just by coincidence, when the police were searching that area of the A3 for the reckless driver, they happened upon Chris and his car. But remember, several of the drivers who called in that night about seeing this reckless driver on the A3, they specifically said they saw the car veer off the embankment and crash down below near the tree line. Like, this is a serious crash. Someone needs to get out here with an ambulance because probably someone's hurt. And then when the police got out and searched the exact area where this crash supposedly happened, they find Chris's car that had all the hallmarks of a car that was driving recklessly on the A3 that veered off and crashed into the woods. I mean, they found Chris and his car because of these calls, but it could not have been Chris. But what other car could it have been? As of today, we do not have a good explanation for how this happened, and so it's been dubbed the A3 ghost crash. At around 5 o'clock in the evening on June 25th, 1999, a man named Ricky McCormick stumbled into an emergency room in St. Louis, Missouri, with his hand over his chest, complaining that he couldn't breathe. He said he had asthma, and earlier that day he had been cutting the grass, and so maybe that had caused a flare-up. But either way, here he was in a lot of discomfort saying, I need help. Ricky was 41 years old, and for his whole life, he had had heart and lung problems, and so him arriving in this state in the ER was actually not all that uncommon for him. And so this hospital did what they did with anyone who came in complaining that they couldn't breathe. They immediately took Ricky to a back exam room, and they hooked him up to all these monitors to make sure his heartbeat was steady and that his oxygen levels were plenty high. And once Ricky was in the exam room getting hooked up, he started acting really agitated, and he kept looking around the room like he was scared that someone was going to jump out at him. And he was also sweating profusely, and whenever he did speak, he spoke so quickly no one could really understand him. But despite Ricky's odd behavior, the heart monitor showed his heart was beating steadily, his oxygen levels were perfectly fine, and when the doctor came in and examined Ricky, even though he clearly saw that something was off about Ricky, there wasn't any sign that there was anything physically wrong with Ricky. And so the doctor and the nurses agreed that whatever was going on with Ricky had to be psychological. And as it happened, Ricky did have a long history of psychological issues. He was known for making things up all the time, just telling people these crazy stories about himself, like how he was this talented singer and he was about to go on tour, or that he was actually a prince, or that he was studying to be a doctor. I mean, things that nobody thought was true, but Ricky would say as if this is just common knowledge. This is who I am. And so Ricky's family for the longest time had just assumed that Ricky was either bipolar or maybe schizophrenic. Those are both serious mental health disorders that totally disrupt normal thinking. But Ricky, despite being encouraged by his friends and family to go get help, never got help for any of his psychological issues. And so Ricky's life had kind of gone off the rails. He had dropped out of high school and not gone back to any sort of schooling, and he had spent some time in jail. Now, Ricky was living in a low-income, very dangerous part of St. Louis, which is a big Midwestern city on the Mississippi River, that in 1999 had a very serious issue with gang violence. Ricky absolutely hated it there, but he had no way to actually leave St. Louis. In fact, Ricky didn't even have his own place. He bounced around from his mother's place, his aunt's place, and his girlfriend's place. Ricky did work, but the work was very sporadic, and it was for the most part just night shifts for random odd jobs. And when Ricky was actually working, he really just spent his time chain smoking cigarettes and drinking literally gallons of coffee. Back at the ER, Ricky, who was still in the exam room, had only been there for less than an hour when the doctor came back in and told Ricky that he was okay and he was going to be discharged. Now, Ricky immediately said, no, I have to be here tonight. I need to stay here. You need to admit me. But the doctor just kind of ignored what he said and handed him the discharge paperwork. 15 minutes later, when a nurse came back into the exam room to get this paperwork from Ricky, she would walk in and see Ricky still sitting on the exam bed, kind of fidgeting around, looking down at this paperwork on his lap that immediately she saw he had not filled out. He had just signed his name at the bottom. And when she walked in, Ricky looked up at her and he kind of shrugged his shoulders and looked at her and was like, "I don't know how to read or write. Can you help me?" And so the nurse immediately felt bad for Ricky. I mean, he's got dirty clothes on, he looks thin and frail, he's clearly very down on his luck, there's some issues happening with this guy, and he can't even fill out his discharge paperwork. And so she said, no problem. She sat down with him, and together they filled out his paperwork. And then afterwards, when she walked him out of the exam room back to the front of the hospital, Ricky turned to her and said, instead of going home, can you just let me stay here in the lobby just for tonight? And this nurse, who knew she was not allowed to do this, she looked around and saw it was not a busy night there. And so she said, okay, as long as you don't bother anyone, you can stay here. And so Ricky thanked her repeatedly and then walked over to the corner, kind of far away from the front desk and far away from the front door. And he sat down and folded his arms, and then he just stared at the front door. And so this nurse assumed that Ricky actually must be homeless, especially based on, how he came in and how he was acting. And so she figured, he needs a place that's warm to stay tonight. And so the nurse went back to her station, and over the course of the next several hours, she would periodically look out into the lobby, expecting to see Ricky kind of curled up asleep in the corner. But every time she looked out there, Ricky was still sitting upright, arms folded, staring at the front door of the hospital as if he was expecting someone to come in at any moment and he needed to be ready. And so she thought this was unusual, but she decided not to intervene. She just let him sit there and do his thing. Later that morning at 11:30 a.m., when the nice nurse who had allowed Ricky to stay in the lobby was leaving her shift, another crew of nurses came in, and right away they noticed Ricky was just sitting in the corner for no apparent reason. And when they walked up to him to ask if he was okay, what are you doing here? What can we do for you? Ricky, instead of trying to talk to any of these nurses, just got up and walked out of the hospital. After leaving the hospital, Ricky walked to a nearby payphone and he called his girlfriend, Sandy. And when Sandy picked up the phone, she immediately recognized her boyfriend's very familiar voice, but she also picked up that he sounded really tired and kind of out of it. And so when she asked him, are you okay? What's going on? Ricky would tell her that he had just spent the night in the hospital. But he didn't clarify that he had spent the night in the lobby of the hospital, not admitted as a patient at the hospital. But to Sandy, it really didn't matter because already this was raising red flags for her, because this was actually the second time that Ricky had gone to the ER just that week. Just a few days earlier, Ricky had been released from a different hospital in St. Louis after telling doctors there that he had had these chest pains and he couldn't breathe. And so he had been admitted for a couple of days, but ultimately they determined that there really was nothing wrong with him. And they too believed whatever was happening with him had to be psychological. And so he had been released. Additionally, Sandy had been growing increasingly worried about Ricky because over the last several weeks, Ricky had begun acting really paranoid, to the point where anytime he was in her apartment and somebody outside the apartment just walked down the hallway, Ricky would jump as if he was worried whoever was out there was going to barge in at any moment. But whenever Sandy asked Ricky, what's going on? Why are you so paranoid? He refused to elaborate. So, feeling very concerned about Ricky, on this phone call, Sandy would say to Ricky, please come to my apartment and let me take care of you. If you're not feeling well, I'll make you feel better. Just please come to my apartment right now. But Ricky said no, he did not want to go to Sandy's apartment. He told her instead he was going to walk to a nearby gas station to get a bite to eat, and then afterwards he would give Sandy a call. And so the two of them agreed to this plan. They hung up. But then Ricky did not call Sandy later. A worker at the gas station where Ricky said he was going would later tell authorities that Ricky did come into the gas station and he got a hot dog on that day, the 26th. And then the next day, this same worker said, yep, we saw Ricky again on the 27th. He came in here, he got a bite to eat, and then he left. But after that, nobody saw Ricky. Not his aunt, not his mom, not his girlfriend. He didn't show up in any other emergency rooms in Missouri. He just disappeared. On June 30th, so 3 days after Ricky was last seen at this gas station, a woman was driving her car 20 miles north of St. Louis on this highway when she looked out into this cornfield that butted up against the highway, and she saw kind of in the middle of it was this dark shape that looked totally out of place. And so she was intrigued enough that she actually pulled over on the road. She got out and began walking into this cornfield to see what this thing was. And when she got up to this thing and saw what it was, she froze in horror, and then she screamed, turned around, and ran back to her car, and she flew to the nearest gas station. She grabbed a payphone and she called 911. When the police arrived at this cornfield, they too walked out towards this dark thing, and then finally they saw what this thing was that had scared this woman. It was a dead person who was lying face down. Their body was very badly decomposed, and in fact, their body was just kind of falling apart, like the fingers of this person's body had just kind of crumpled off of their hands. Now, based on what this person was wearing, they appeared to be male, but there was no way to tell how this person died or really how long they had been dead for. But despite the advanced decomposition, authorities were able to get a good fingerprint, and it would turn out that this body belonged to Ricky McCormick. The day after Ricky's body was found, the police would come out and say they were treating his death as a homicide. This area along this highway in this cornfield was actually a fairly common place for murderers to dump their victims. And it was very unlikely that Ricky had gotten there by himself. He didn't have a car. In fact, he didn't even have a driver's license. There was no public transportation that could have brought him to this spot. And if Ricky had decided to walk to this area for some reason, it was a solid 15 miles from where he lived and worked. Also, Ricky's body was way too decomposed relative to when he had last been seen alive, just 3 days earlier. And so there was a theory that perhaps he was killed somewhere else and then kept indoors in heat, and that had accelerated his decomposition, and then at some point whoever had killed him had moved his body and dumped it in this cornfield. And so on that first day of the homicide investigation, July 1st, the police put 18 detectives, so a ton of detectives, on this case, and they also appealed to the public to come forward if you had any information about what could have happened to Ricky McCormick. But just a day later, on July 2nd, the police came out and made an announcement that, after looking at all the evidence and looking at Ricky's body again, it did not appear, in fact, that he had been murdered, but instead he must have died of natural causes. This is a guy that had lung and heart problems, and so that is likely what killed him. Case closed. And so after this announcement, all of the evidence in Ricky's case was bundled up, put into storage, and people just kind of forgot about it. 6 months later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, got a tip that involved Ricky McCormick. They were working on a case in St. Louis, Missouri about this major drug dealer who apparently was ordering hits on his rivals, and a confidential informant came forward and told the FBI that this guy, Ricky McCormick, had gotten wrapped up with this major drug dealer. But they didn't really know what role Ricky was playing with this drug dealer. It was just kind of a rumor on the street that, Ricky was involved somehow. This did not make any sense to the FBI because they're thinking, why would this big-time drug dealer who really was a mover and shaker in St. Louis get involved with this guy, Ricky McCormick, who was obviously deeply mentally ill and borderline homeless? I mean, what role could Ricky play for this drug dealer? But the FBI still did follow up on this tip because it was very credible. And when they spoke to the local police who had investigated Ricky's death, they got Ricky's file, which meant they got all of the evidence. And immediately, the FBI realized the local police had overlooked a very strange piece of evidence found in Ricky's pocket. This strange evidence was quickly sent to FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, and it landed on the desk of a forensic analyst named Dan Olson. Dan was relatively new to the FBI, but he was highly disciplined and very methodical. And so when he received this piece of evidence, he got to work right away trying to figure out what it was, what it meant in relationship to Ricky and this drug dealer, and, maybe does it answer the question of how these people are connected? But despite his best efforts in calling in the experts and using every computer program to analyze this evidence, he just could not figure out what it meant. At the same time that Dan was doing this, the big drug dealer who was the target of that big FBI investigation in St. Louis was arrested on gun and drug charges, and so the big case was now over. And suddenly, trying to figure out what connection Ricky McCormick had to this drug dealer was kind of irrelevant because the drug dealer was behind bars and Ricky was already dead. And so the FBI kind of put a pause on trying to figure out what this evidence was. And so Dan, even though he was really curious now, he was fully invested in trying to figure out what this thing was, he realized he had to give it up too and move on to something else. And so the strange evidence went back into storage, and once again, everyone just kind of moved on from Ricky McCormick. But Dan never really forgot about this mystifying piece of evidence. It was always in the back of his mind. 22 years later, Dan Olson had now become very senior at the FBI. He was actually in charge of their cryptanalysis and racketeering unit. Basically, he was in charge of the people at the FBI who specialized in code breaking, meaning they were the people that would pull any sort of secret messages embedded inside of evidence. And so at some point after taking over this unit, Dan pulled out of storage this strange piece of evidence connected to Ricky McCormick. And he said, you know what? I just need to know what this means. I have to figure it out. I've never been able to. It's haunted me ever since. And so Dan went public. He went to the media and he asked the world to take a look at this mystifying piece of evidence and come forward if you have any idea what it means. When Ricky was discovered in that cornfield, the local police quickly emptied his pockets, and in his pants pocket were 2 documents that contained an incredibly complex cipher or code. It was basically 30 lines on each piece of paper with different symbols and letters and capital letters. I mean, it looked like total gibberish to the untrained eye. But to people like Dan and his code-breaking team, these symbols and letters could mean there was a secret message hidden inside of these documents if you could break the code system. But of course, no one could ever break that code. So how in the world does a guy like Ricky, who is basically functionally illiterate and can only write his name, he's clearly mentally ill and he's not really in touch with reality all the time, how does a guy like that come to be in possession of these complex ciphers? And if he didn't write these ciphers, because that's possible, maybe somebody else gave them to Ricky, well, why would anyone who came up with this very complex cipher entrust a guy like Ricky to be the one to carry these things around? I mean, presumably, they contain confidential information that's been very carefully hidden inside of the cipher. And so why give it to Ricky? He's such a liability. And also, what happened to Ricky in that cornfield? I mean, we don't even know how he got there. We don't know how he was killed. All we know is that he had these ciphers in his pocket when he was found. And so many people believe, including law enforcement, that the answer to, what happened to Ricky and what was his connection to this drug lord in St. Louis, if any, or, what was he up to, will all be solved if we can just figure out what these two ciphers mean. But as of right now, no one has solved the riddle of what these two ciphers mean. All we know is that Ricky McCormick, a couple of weeks before he died, became increasingly paranoid and was so scared of someone or something that he was likely running into these hospitals just to hide out. But eventually, whoever or whatever Ricky was scared of very likely caught up to him and killed him. But until we crack these ciphers, we very likely will have no idea what actually happened to Ricky McCormick. Today, the FBI has set up a special website where you can look at these two ciphers that Ricky had in his pocket, and if you're able to crack them, because someone's going to eventually, you can tell the FBI through this website and potentially help solve Ricky's murder. On March 7th, 2015, a police officer named Tyler Beddoes, along with his partner, were driving in his police cruiser near the Spanish Fork River in Utah when suddenly a police dispatcher came on over the radio. And this dispatcher was speaking very urgently and said, "Hey, a fisherman has just called in to say that he spotted what looks like an upturned SUV partially submerged in the Spanish Fork River right underneath the bridge. And whoever is closest to this bridge, get over there and see if there's anybody inside the vehicle that can be saved." And so Officer Beddoes and his partner, they knew they were very near this bridge. And so immediately they banged a U-turn, they drove to the bridge, but from the road, they looked down and couldn't see any SUV. But they saw there were some firefighters and paramedics that were also converging at the spot on the road, and everybody's getting out and running down to the riverbank. And so Beddoes and his partner did the same thing. They got out and they ran down. And then finally, when they got to the riverbank and they saw underneath this bridge, sure enough, there was this red SUV upturned, partially submerged, and he noticed right away that none of the doors had been opened in this SUV. And so it meant whoever was driving this vehicle when it flipped over very likely was still inside. And so Officer Beddoes and his partner and the other first responders just jumped into this icy cold river and began making their way closer and closer to this upturned SUV, which again, it's not fully submerged. It's like a third of the way underwater. So if you were sitting in the seat inside of this vehicle and you were an adult, your head would basically be in the water if you were still strapped into the seat. And as they're making their way towards this SUV, when they got close enough, they began hearing a woman inside of the vehicle screaming, "Hey, we're in here! Come over here, help!" But when Officer Beddoes and the rest of the first responders actually reached the SUV, the water was so murky and it basically completely covered up the windows that they weren't really able to look into the vehicle. They could just hear this woman yelling, but that was it. And then when they tried to open up the doors, they couldn't do it because the roof had begun to cave in, and so the actual framing of the door wouldn't open. And so all these first responders, it's like their adrenaline's pumping and they're like, "Come on, we got to push this thing up onto its side so we can get in." And so all these first responders are pushing and pushing, and slowly but surely they began to raise the side of this vehicle up until the windows suddenly were clear, and Officer Beddoes and the others were able to look into the car, and they saw there was a woman in the driver's seat and there was a baby in a car seat dangling upside down in the back seat, still strapped in. And so Beddoes began screaming, "There's a baby in here, there's a baby in here." And suddenly it was like everybody got extra strength and they pushed this vehicle all the way up onto its side. And then one of the firefighters climbed up onto the side of the car, which now was the highest point of the car. And he reached in and he clipped these straps holding the baby who'd been upside down, dangling there, cut the straps and pulled the baby out and handed the baby over to Officer Beddoes. And then the firefighter began doing the same thing to get the woman out. But Officer Beddoes, at this point, he just took this baby, he turned away, he figured the first responders will handle this woman, and he's gonna take this baby to safety, because he couldn't even tell if the baby was alive or not. And so he's cradling this baby, he's rushing back through the water, back to the riverbank, and then he hands the baby over to the paramedics, and right as he does, he sees this little baby begins to move its arms and flicker its eyes, and he wanted to weep out of relief that this child was okay. They put the baby onto a stretcher, they put the baby in the ambulance, and they whisked the baby away to the hospital where this baby would survive. But after the baby had been taken away, Officer Beddoes turned his attention back to the SUV and back to the woman to see how she was doing. But he could tell right away from the way people were acting, all the other first responders that were still dealing with the crisis in the water, the way they were acting indicated that something is off here. Well, it would turn out 14 hours earlier, so at around 10 p.m. the previous night, a 28-year-old woman named Jennifer Gorsbeck had just left her father's house in Salem, Utah, and in her car was her little 18-month-old baby, Lily, who was in the back seat. And after Jennifer pulled away from her father's house and her father's on the porch waving to her, she began driving towards her home. But something happened around 10:30 p.m. that night. We don't know what, but something caused Jennifer to careen off the road on that bridge and flip over and land in the water. Maybe she fell asleep at the wheel or an animal jumped out, we don't know, but we know at 10:30 she careens off the bridge and she lands in that river. And then for 14 hours, she and her baby remained upside down in that river. Until finally, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders came rushing over to open it up and get them out of there. And if you recall, all the first responders, Officer Beddoes included, heard Jennifer screaming that they were in the car, "Come save us, please." But what they would find out is that could not have been Jennifer, because Jennifer was killed on impact when the car fell into the water. Only Lily survived the crash, and then Lily, who's nearly hypothermic and she's upside down with water like 2 inches away from her head, for 14 hours she dangled there, and when she was pulled out, according to doctors, was like a couple of minutes before she would have died from hypothermia. And so without that voice, Lily almost certainly would have died, because it was the sound of that voice that really encouraged all these first responders to find the strength and get that car up on its side and then get the baby out of there. We don't know whose voice that belonged to, but for sure, it saved Lily's life. And again, baby Lily would make a full recovery, and to this day, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders, they know what they heard and they do not have an explanation for it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. At 5 a.m. on September 30th, 2008, a 61-year-old man named Xian Tie-xiong finished getting dressed inside of the bedroom that he shared with his wife in the city of Beijing, China. After he finished getting dressed, Xian reached down and scooped up his backpack off the floor that was already packed, and then he carefully walked around his bed, trying to be as quiet as possible, and then as quietly as he could, he kind of tiptoed around the bed to his wife's side to give her a kiss goodbye. Xian was going to be heading out to a local mountain that day for a day hike. And so Xian, he gets next to his wife and he bends down to kiss her, and right as he does that, he accidentally wakes her up. And so his wife opens her eyes and she looks up at him, and Xian just says, I love you. He gives her a kiss and he tells her, hey, I'll be back tonight before midnight. And so his wife, she kind of groggily said, okay, and she grabbed his hand and squeezed it, and she told him that she loved him, and then she fell back asleep, and moments later, Xian had left the bedroom and walked out the front door. Xian's home was only a couple of blocks away from the train station, and since he needed to ride a train and then also a bus to get to this local mountain that was about an hour and a half journey away, the train station was his first stop. And so Xian, as he walked towards the station, he was all smiles. I mean, he was really excited about this day. So Zhen was retired, but he had spent his whole life teaching geography at Beijing No. 5 Middle School. And he was a very passionate teacher, but the thing he was most passionate about, that he routinely really pushed on his students, in some ways more than geography, was his love of nature. In fact, Xian loved nature so much that when he was not teaching, he basically spent all of his off time out in nature going for hikes. I mean, that was his thing. And today, Xian was especially excited about his hike because he was hiking one of his favorite trails. It was located on Mount Miaofeng, which is a mountain located 30 miles to the northwest of where Xian lived. And this mountain was quite famous because of all the sacred and ancient temples that kind of dotted the mountain all over the place. And then also there were all these beautiful roses, like the flower, that would bloom all over the mountain in the summer. And so it's just this totally strikingly beautiful place. And normally Xian would actually hike up this trail and then actually camp out on Mount Miaofeng, mostly because on the summit there was this incredible view of downtown Beijing. And at night, the view is like spectacular with the city all lit up. But on this particular day, Xian knew an overnight stay was not possible because he had to be back home by the next day because it was his mother's 90th birthday. And he was very close with his mother, and he was not going to miss that. And so Xian eventually made it to the train station. He bought his ticket, he boarded his train, and then he sat down in a seat. And as soon as he did, he opened up his bag and pulled out a stack of papers. For this hike, Xian had packed himself some food and water inside of his backpack. He also packed a newspaper called the Beijing Youth Daily, and he brought along his diary. But his diary was a little bit unique. Zhen, because he loved nature so much and didn't like the idea of wasting anything, what he would do when he was a teacher at Beijing No. 5 Middle School, he would just take scrap paper and start writing on that. He would compile all his scrap paper into these sort of diaries that he would keep. And so the reason he did that was primarily because he was so in love with nature, he hated the idea of wasting anything. And so Xian passed the time on the train by writing in his diary, aka his stack of scrap paper, and also reading this newspaper. And Zhen knew he really needed to read the entire newspaper pretty quickly because by the time he got to the mountain, he was going to do what he always did, which is he would bring a newspaper with him on a hike, and as he walked, he would take out a page periodically and tie it to a tree, kind of marking his way. That way, when he turned around and came back down, he would have his path marked because Xian did not always walk on a clearly marked trail, and so this was his way of not getting lost. And so Xian would ride the train car, and then he would get off and he would board a bus. And then finally, right around 7 a.m., that bus would come to a stop in the tiny village of Chanfang, which is located right at the base of Mount Miaofeng. And so Xian grabbed his backpack, he hopped off the bus, and then began walking through the village towards the mountain. And then by about 7:20 a.m., so not long after Xian had left the bus, he was almost up to Mount Miaofeng when he pulled out his cell phone and he called his cousin. It was a brief conversation, and all Xian really wanted to do was just to make sure his cousin was going to be around the next day for Xian's mother's birthday. And the cousin said he would, and so Xian told him, okay, I'm going hiking today, and I will see you tomorrow. And then he hung up. And then, only a couple minutes later, Xian disappeared into the beautiful forests of Mount Miaofeng. So Xian's wife did not expect to hear from Xian at any point that day because she knew he would have terrible cell phone service up on the mountain. But she did expect her husband to be home on time. He had told her that morning before he left that he would be home that night before midnight. And if you knew Xian, you knew this guy was never late. He said, I'm going to be someplace at a certain time, he would be there. So when 10 p.m. rolled around that night and still Xian was not back yet and he had not called, Xian's wife was actually not worried because she was thinking, okay, well, it's 10. He'll be home in the next couple of hours because he said he'd be here by midnight tonight and he will be here tonight. And so she went to bed expecting to wake up and see Xian in bed with her in the morning. But the next morning when she woke up, Xian was not in bed, so he did not come home, and so his wife immediately was very concerned and began calling Xian's family, and nobody knew where he was. And so that day, the family went to the police and they reported Jian missing. The local police immediately organized a search for Jian. However, they knew this was going to be a very challenging search. Mount Miaofeng is not some enormous mountain by any means. It's a decent-sized mountain, but, it's really known for having these paths that twist and turn all over the place, so it's pretty easy to get lost. And then also there's a whole bunch of sheer cliff faces kind of all over the place, so if you're not paying attention, you could literally just walk off a ledge. So in short, this is a dangerous and confusing place. And at the same time that the search was happening out on the mountain, the police were also in contact with Jian's cell phone service provider to see if they could track down Jian's cell phone, because obviously if they could find that, they might find Jian too. But the only way a cell phone can be tracked is if the cell phone is on, because when it's on, it connects to the nearest cell phone tower, and that's how these service providers are able to tell where these phones are. They look to see which tower it's connected to. But when Jian's cell phone service provider looked for his phone, they quickly determined his phone was off. So unless the phone came back on again, they would not be able to locate the phone. However, they were able to pull all of Jian's cell phone signal history up until his phone was turned off. And what they found in this signal history is the day before, so the day Jian went missing, his cell phone was on at 4 p.m. that evening, and he received a phone call at 4 p.m. And the service provider was able to see that when this phone call came in, Jian's cell phone was not where they thought it would be. It was not high up Mount Miaofeng. It actually was near the base of the mountain. And when police reached out to the person who had called Jian at 4 p.m., they discovered it was just a friend of Jian's, and this friend said that Jian said he was coming down the mountain now and he'd be home soon. So this new information did basically line up with what Jian had told his family he'd be doing that day, just a quick day hike. Although again, they kind of expected it to be a little bit longer. It seemed a little odd he'd be down the mountain by 4 p.m., but still, this basically lined up with what they thought he was doing. However, this new information did not help explain what happened to Jian. Like, why was he missing? The expectation was he must have gotten lost or hurt or something up on this mountain. Maybe he's stranded somewhere and can't go anywhere. But now, based on this phone call, it sounded an awful lot like Jian was not even on the mountain when he disappeared. So where was he? Police had already checked all the bus stations and train stations in the area, to see if maybe Jian took a different way home or something. But when they went to all these different stations, there was no evidence that Jian had been to any of them. And there was another problem. Members of Jian's family told the police about Jian's habit of tying newspapers to trees to mark his trail as he hiked. And the family told the police that Jian did this every single time he hiked. And his wife told the police that for sure she knew her husband had brought along a copy of that newspaper. So by all expectations, there should be markers up on that mountain, literally leading searchers to wherever Jian went. But after an entire day of searching Mount Miaofeng, they didn't find a single newspaper anywhere. For the next several days, this big search for Jian continued, but nothing was found. That is, until October 7th, so 1 week after Jian had vanished. On that day, Jian's cell phone service provider noticed that Jian's cell phone had suddenly turned back on. And the phone was not on or near Mount Miaofeng. Instead, it was located 36 miles away from the mountain at a train station called Beijing West Railway Station. Now, the cell phone was only on for a couple of seconds, but it was on long enough for the provider to confirm that it really was in that location. And so the police immediately dispatched a team to go to Beijing West Railway Station and see if they could find Jian. But when they got there, Jian was not there. His phone was not there. They looked at all the security footage. There was no sign of Jian. They searched the surrounding areas. Nothing. And on this day, at basically the same time that police are at this railway station trying to make sense of, what's going on with the cell phone, a villager from Chanfang village, which is that little village that sits at the base of Mount Miaofeng, came forward with a very strange story. He said on the day that Jian disappeared, this villager was at his little shop. He sold walnuts to hikers that were making their way towards Mount Miaofeng. It was basically like snacks for the hike. And he sees this guy walking up through the village towards the mountain, and he looked exactly like Jian, because now Jian's face was on the news and this villager had seen it, and so he felt like he had seen Jian. And so this villager said, this guy who looked exactly like Jian, he walked up and actually stopped at this villager's shop to buy some walnuts. And this villager and this man who looked like Jian, they just chatted for a few minutes. And at some point, this guy who looked like Jian asked the villager, hey, these are great, but where else can I buy walnuts? I want to buy other types of walnuts and bring them back to my family. And so this villager was like, oh yeah, well, the best walnuts in all of Beijing are actually located about 30 miles away at the base of another mountain. It's called Tietua Mountain, and there are vendors over there who sell the best walnuts. So that's your answer right over there. And then after the villager said this guy who looked just like Jian, it's like everything changed for him. It's like his expression changed, his tone changed. It's like he's been given this information that's changed his life, about these walnuts. And he says to the villager, okay, I'm gonna go there right now. And without saying anything else, this man just turned and began quickly walking away from the walnuts, back through town, back towards the bus stop. So away from Mount Miaofeng. In theory, this guy is going to the bus to commute 30 miles to this other mountain, Tietua Mountain, to get these walnuts? I mean, the villager does not know this guy, but even he felt like this is bizarre. This guy comes up, he's buying snacks to go hike Mount Miaofeng. He seems really excited about it. And I offhandedly mention these walnuts, and he's like, boom, I'm out of here. I'm going to go 30 miles to this other mountain to get these walnuts. It just seemed weird. And then when police spoke to Jian's family about this new information, they would learn that Jian did not have a special interest in walnuts, and neither did his family. And even if there was a reason why Jian just really wanted these walnuts, he would not have had time in that day to take the bus 30 miles to Tietua Mountain, get these walnuts, go 30 miles back, and hike up Mount Miaofeng, because he can't stay the night. He needs to come back tonight in order to go to his mother's birthday party the next day. So it just made no sense. But this walnut thing was basically the only lead police really had, because everything else was a dead end. And so they decided to shift their search area from Mount Miaofeng to Tietua Mountain. And pretty much right away, they saw something that gave them hope that Jian could be here. They found pages from the Beijing Youth Daily newspaper tied to trees on the mountain. And when they looked more closely at the newspapers, they found the publication date of this newspaper lined up with the copy that Jian would have had with him on the day he vanished. And so, of course, the searchers just began following this trail of newspapers, hoping Jian would be at the other end. For 2 days, searchers very diligently followed this trail up the mountain and kind of wound around, and they went pretty slowly because as they're moving, they're constantly checking everything around. They don't want to miss any clues. But finally, after 2 days of following this trail, they eventually found something. The newspapers led them to a campsite. Now, the campsite was abandoned, but there was a bed of hay, there were some used water bottles, and some toilet paper. And so just from the looks of it, this campsite looked relatively active, like somebody had been staying here recently for at least a day or two. And so it seemed pretty likely, based on everything else, that this was Jian's campsite. And pretty quickly, after searching the campsite, they found something that virtually guaranteed that this was his campsite. Authorities found this plastic bag that was sitting next to the bed, and inside of the bag was a piece of scrap paper from Beijing No. 5 Middle School. And on this scrap paper was a note. And the note said Jian had indeed hiked up Tietua Mountain on September 30th. This would have been the day that he left, so the day he disappeared. And then on his way down, he said he got lost and was forced to spend the night out here. And so that explained the campsite. And then on October 1st, so that would have been the day after he spent the night out here, he said he was going to attempt to follow the ridge line down the mountain to a nearby village to safety. And this note ended with the phrase, "Leaving this note here just in case. love to everyone who passes by. Now, at first glance, this note was like amazing news because suddenly it seemed totally possible that Jian was just fine. I mean, the way the note was written, it sounded like he was at least healthy and safe, albeit I'm sure he was not happy to be stuck up on a mountain, but, he loved being in nature, and so he seemed okay. And then he had a reasonable plan for how he was going to get out of there, follow the ridgeline, go down to a village, go to safety. But as the police analyzed this note, they noticed that some things were off about it. First of all, this note basically directly contradicts other facts of this case. Remember, cell phone records prove Jian got a phone call at 4 p.m. on the day he went missing from his friend, and his friend would report that Jian told him that he was coming down Mount Miaofeng and he'd be home soon. But according to the note they found, that was not possible, because the note said Jian at 4 p.m. on September 30th, the day he went missing, he would have been on Tietua Mountain, either hiking up or being in the process of getting lost and, ultimately making that campsite where he'd camped out for at least one night. And so in addition to this factual discrepancy with this note, another issue with the note was just the way it was written. Now, Jian's wife had a chance to look at the note, and she would say, "That is my husband's handwriting." But the note contained a bunch of very strange language choices that just didn't make sense for Jian to be using. For example, this note, which really should have been a first-person point of view, Jian has gotten lost, he's by himself, he's writing to the world, kind of letting somebody know what's going on with him, and so it really should have been written in the first person. My name is Jian, I am lost, here's what I'm doing. But the note was written in the third person. Jian got lost on the mountain, and so he is going to camp out for the night, and tomorrow he's going to make his way out to safety. But despite being written in the third person, it did sound like somebody was talking about themselves. It did not feel like somebody else was attempting to document what Jian was doing. But by far, the weirdest part of this note was the tone shift that happened about halfway through. So the first half of this letter was written, albeit in the third person, but it was grammatically correct and sort of formal, like you would expect from a very well-educated retired teacher. But once you get to that second half of the note, the grammar started being really awkward, and then the very final line, which says, "Love to everyone who passes by," that actually sounds totally awkward in Chinese. So, "love to everyone who passes by" is the translation into English, and that basically makes sense to us, like that's not an awkward phrase. But if you put it back in Chinese, it's so awkward. It would be like if I tried to say to you, "I take the bus to work," but instead I said, "To work, take bus." Right? Like I wouldn't say it that way, and it would immediately seem very awkward for anybody who knows me if I wrote or said something like that. And so this last line stood out so much that actually police and friends and family of Jian assumed he must have left that in there as like a secret message or a code, like a distress signal, especially when you consider the other weird factors around this note. But nobody could figure out what it meant. The day after this note was discovered, a searcher was up in the vicinity of Jian's campsite on Tietua Mountain, and they were walking around, kind of retracing their footsteps, looking for new places to search. When they turned a corner, and up ahead, they noticed there was this tree kind of hanging out over this rocky cliff, and dangling from the tree was something gray that looked sort of out of place. And so the searcher, sensing this could be a clue of Jian's whereabouts, he yelled out for other searchers in the area that he had found something, and then he took off running towards this thing to see what it was. And when he got up to the tree, he looked up and he saw it was a pair of sweatpants that had clearly been intentionally tied to this branch in the tree. And so the searcher, he reached up and grabbed one of the pant legs and kind of tugged on it. And when he did, all these white things began falling out of the pants and landing on the ground. And when the searcher stopped and looked down to see what they were, he couldn't believe it. It was a whole pile of human bones. However, they were not Jian's. In fact, nobody ever figured out who these bones belonged to or why they were stuffed inside of pants and tied to a tree on this mountain. But the discovery of these bones would open up a whole new mystery Because after these bones were found, all the searchers came over and basically just began combing the area near these bones, and the police began uncovering body after body after body. They found 2 more sets of human bones stuffed into pants and tied to trees, and they found the other bodies at the foot of a cliff, and also inside of this well, and inside of this cave. And so in total, authorities found 10 sets of human remains in the vicinity near Jian's campsite, but none of the human remains belonged to Jian. Officials were only able to identify a few of the bodies, and they were not able to figure out how they died or whether or not foul play was involved. But the discovery of those bodies did mean one thing for Jian's case. It meant, all these people had previously gone up Tietua Mountain before Jian went up and vanished, and when these other people went up the mountain, clearly something horrible happened to them, and we don't know what it is. Is there a killer on the loose? Is there some animal or creature out there that's taken people out? We don't know. But what started to happen since Jian went missing and his story was all over the news in China is that all these other hikers who've been on Tietua Mountain before have begun sharing their experiences when they hiked up Tietua Mountain, and some of their stories about what they've seen on that mountain are horrifying. One person said they were walking up the mountain, they had their partner with them who was a little bit farther back the trail, and so they're kind of walking up on their own, and the first person, as they're walking up the trail, suddenly sees this guy just kind of come out of nowhere wielding an axe, and he walks up to this person, and all he says is, "Are you alone?" And the hiker's like, "No, my partner's back there, they're coming up here, what's going on?" But the axe man, he basically acted like he didn't even hear their answer, and he just asked it again, "Are you alone?" And the hiker was like, "No, my partner's back there." And the Axeman again just said, "Are you alone? Are you alone? Are you alone?" And this axe person kept doing that until the hiker and their partner just turned and ran. And then another hiker shared a story about how they were walking up a trail on Tietua Mountain, and at some point they lifted their head up, and he saw a little ways up the trail, kind of off the trail, so in the tree line, were all these people, like this group of strangers, just standing there motionless, kind of half behind trees, like they were kind of trying to hide themselves, but also not. And they were just staring at this hiker, unmoving, not speaking, just staring. And so the hiker, they look up and they see this, and they were so unnerved so quickly that they just turned and left, and they have no idea who those people were. And so obviously we have no way of verifying these other hikers' stories about what they saw on Tietua Mountain. But when you combine their testimony with Jian's story, it really makes you wonder, what's going on up there? The official search for Jian was called off at the end of October, so roughly 1 month after he vanished. But unofficially, the search for Jian continues to this day. However, they still have not found his body, and basically no real progress has been made. On June 1st, 1937, Amelia Earhart took off from Oakland, California on an eastbound flight around the world. It was her second attempt to become the first pilot ever to circumnavigate the globe. She, along with her flight navigator Fred Noonan, flew to Miami and then down to South America, across the Atlantic to Africa, and then east to India and Southeast Asia. The pair reached Lae, New Guinea on June 29th. A couple days later, on July 2nd, Earhart and Noonan would depart Lae, and they would make their way to tiny Howland Island, which was their next refueling stop, but they would never arrive. What Earhart was trying to accomplish at the time was such a big deal, and so when they disappeared, it was heartbreaking, and it made international headlines, and this huge search is launched for them, but they can't find them, and after 2 weeks, they officially declared they were lost at sea and most likely dead. 3 years later, and 350 miles away from Howland Island, which was the island Earhart and Noonan were trying to get to before they vanished, a British scientist was on this tiny little uninhabited island called Niku Maroro, and they made a startling discovery. He found an incomplete skeleton next to what looked like the remains of a campfire, and their skeleton was kind of torn all over the place, like they had been ripped limb from limb. Because of Niku Maroro's proximity to Howland Island, Everybody speculated that this has got to be the body of either Amelia Earhart or Noonan. The bones were sent to 2 doctors in Fiji, and they unfortunately said, no, this isn't Earhart or Noonan, this is somebody else. So those bones were ultimately disposed of because no one could claim them or knew who they were, and everybody just kind of forgot about it until 2017, when a forensic anthropologist decided to manually re-examine the measurements of the bones that were taken off of Niku Maroro Island and compare them to real measurements of Amelia Earhart. And they discovered that clearly those doctors in Fiji had made a mistake, because the measurements of these bones match Amelia Earhart almost exactly. So researchers go back to Niku Maroro Island, and they go to the area where these bones were found near that campfire, and they look around and they find a couple 1930s era bottles, glass bottles, and one of them is a freckle cream, and Amelia Earhart had lots of freckles and she liked to use freckle cream to cover them up. She was kind of famous for doing that. And so they found that freckle cream on this island near bones that look like they belong to Amelia Earhart. So while some scientists are putting their energy into confirming that yes, those bones were Amelia Earhart. We don't have the bones, but we can show you with the measurements and the freckle cream. And there's another picture that apparently shows the landing gear of her plane off of Niku Maroro Island. So there's some people that are working on that angle, and there's another group of scientists and researchers that are saying, okay, let's assume that that really was Amelia Earhart. Let's figure out what happened to her once she got to Niku Maroro Island. And the leading theory is horrifying. Although Niku Maroro Island is uninhabited by people, it is inhabited by one of the scariest creatures on the planet, the coconut crab. They're 3 feet long, they can carry at least 6 times their body weight, and they use their pincers that are as strong as a lion's jaw to rip open coconuts, which is their main source of food. But coconuts are not the only thing they eat. They'll also eat pigs, they'll eat each other, they'll even eat themselves. And they're prolific climbers because they need to get up to get to the coconuts. But in some parts of the world, they use their climbing ability to climb up and grab birds and break their wings with their pincers and then drag them into their underground burrows where they will eat them too. The few researchers and scientists that have gone out to Niku Maroro Island have said at night, thousands of these crabs will emerge from their underground burrows and they'll go looking for food. And they have a really keen sense of smell, and they can smell blood. So when one of the crabs goes up and grabs a bird and starts ripping it apart, the thousands of others will come charging over and swarm the bird because they've smelled the blood, and they'll rip it to pieces and they'll all try to get in on the action. And so the theory goes, Earhart and Noonan are making their way to Howland Island. They get off track somehow and they wind up crash landing 350 miles away on Niku Maroro Island on one of the reefs. Noonan probably dies on impact, and Earhart, who's badly wounded and probably bleeding, she gets onto the island and she makes her way up to that area where that campfire was found. And for some amount of time, Earhart is able to survive off of whatever she had on her in those glass bottles, but in her weakened state and bleeding, at some point she probably attracted the coconut crabs, who one night came out and swarmed her, ripped her to pieces, and ate her. Today, Niku Maroro Island is only inhabited by the coconut crabs, and it's protected land under the Republic of Kiribati. And so if you want to go, you have to get express permission from the Republic of Kiribati, and they send someone to go with you. And there's no airport on the island, so you have to land on a separate island and then ride to Niku Maroro on a boat. But you have to pass through Cyclone Alley, which means you can only travel there at certain parts of the year, and even then it's incredibly dangerous.
One night in the early 1940s, in a small town in eastern Kentucky, a highly respected local man named Arthur Lewis silently made his way down a dark road. Everybody who knew Arthur, and that was most people in this small town, knew him as an upstanding, law-abiding citizen. But tonight, Arthur clutched a hammer and a chisel in his hands and crept as slowly and quietly as he could because he didn't want anybody to know what he was doing. The moon and stars cast an eerie glow across the town. Arthur was not a superstitious person. In fact, he was pretty much the opposite. But the way the moonlight hit the trees along the road made it look like something was moving in the shadows, and Arthur couldn't help but feel creeped out. Still, the moon and stars provided the perfect amount of light for Arthur to see where he was going without being seen. So he took a breath, collected himself, and moved quickly through the shadows on the road. After walking for a few minutes, he turned onto another dirt road that led to the top of a small hill that was ringed by trees. There were a few old wooden houses along this dirt road, and Arthur saw lights on inside a couple of them. So he crouched down a little bit more to try to hide himself in the dark and picked up his pace. Arthur stopped when he reached the top of the hill. A wrought iron gate and fence stood in his path, and there was a thick metal chain with a lock on it wrapped around the gate. Arthur scanned the darkness all around him and took another steadying breath. He knew everybody in town would think what he was about to do was crazy, because this land belonged to a man named Carl Pruitt, and Carl Pruitt was dangerous. But tonight, Arthur didn't care. He was on a mission. Arthur pulled on the gate, but the chain and lock kept it closed tight. So he walked a couple of feet away from the gate and just tossed his hammer and chisel over the fence, which was only a few feet tall. And so Arthur grabbed on to the thin wrought iron bars that made up this fence, and very carefully he climbed up and leapt over to the other side. When he landed, he scooped up his hammer and chisel and walked through some overgrown grass. Now, despite having the hammer and chisel, Arthur did not come to this place in order to work. Instead, he came here to vandalize the place. He had come here really to prove a point. He wanted to show the people in town that Carl Pruitt was not as powerful as they all thought, and they didn't have to live in fear of him any longer. Just then, Arthur spotted the engraved stone marker he was looking for, a marker that declared in capital letters that this patch of land was Carl's. So he gripped his chisel tightly and walked towards the marker. But just as he drew close to the marker and raised his tools to strike, Arthur suddenly froze. He couldn't tell if the moon and stars were playing tricks on him, but it looked like a shadow of a large chain had appeared on the ground in front of him. Arthur instinctively turned around, but he saw he was way too far away from the gate for the chain on it to be casting a shadow all the way over here. However, when Arthur turned back around, the shadow of the chain was now gone. Arthur was shaken up, but he kind of laughed at himself and shook it off. Things always seem to look strange in the dark. And so Arthur placed the metal blade of the chisel directly on the stone marker and then slammed the hammer into the back of the chisel. A piece of the stone flew off and fell to the ground, and right away Arthur forgot all about that weird shadow he'd just seen. And instead, he just continued chipping away as fast as he could. He knew the noise he was making could attract attention from the people who lived nearby, and he had no intention of getting caught tonight. But just then, Arthur heard a sound over all the noise he was making, and it sounded like footsteps, exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. Arthur stopped hammering and crouched down a few feet away from the stone marker, trying his best to hide. But as Arthur looked around in the darkness, he didn't see anyone. And eventually, the footstep sounds disappeared, at which point Arthur told himself it must have just been the wind blowing through the trees or something, and a bit apprehensively, he got back to work with his hammer and chisel. But suddenly, the sound of the footsteps came back, and this time they were so much louder, and they seemed much closer. Whoever it was, they were clearly making their way towards Arthur. And so Arthur had no idea if it was someone from one of the nearby houses, or if a local cop had shown up or something, but either way, he wasn't sticking around to find out. And so he turned around to make a run for it when he froze, because something was standing right in front of him, blocking his way. Arthur began to shake with fear, and then without thinking, he dropped the hammer and chisel and took off running. Minutes later, in a house located about halfway down the road from where Arthur was, a man was sitting in his front room when he heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the top of the nearby hill that belonged to Carl Pruitt. The man just froze for a second. The sound frightened him, but it also confused him, because people just did not go up to the top of that hill anymore. But in the eerie silence that followed that scream, this man sort of snapped out of his confusion and shouted for his wife to stay inside, and then he ran to the kitchen and found his flashlight. The man stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and ran to the dirt road that led up to the top of the hill. and as he did, he saw a beam from another flashlight a couple yards ahead of him. He quickly recognized that it was his neighbor, so he called out to him. The neighbor turned around and walked a few steps back down the road, and the two men quickly exchanged notes about the scream they had heard. And then, together, they rushed towards the top of the hill. Once they got there, they arrived in front of the wrought iron gate, and when they shined their flashlights through it onto the ground, they saw something lying just on the other side of the gate. They both just stared at the ground for a few seconds in silence, transfixed by how gruesome the scene was. Finally, one of the two men said he'd go get help, and then he turned and ran back down the hill and headed straight into town. A little later that night, the man who had gone to get help returned to the top of the hill to the gate, now with a police officer. The neighbor who'd been there before hadn't moved. All three men lifted their flashlights and shined them on the ground just beyond the gate. And together, they all stared at the dead body of Arthur Lewis. The metal chain that had been used to keep the gate locked had been removed and was wrapped around Arthur's neck, and Arthur's face had turned a sickly bluish gray. The three men looked up from the body, and they all just nodded to each other. In most circumstances, the discovery of a dead body like this would cause shock and alarm. But these three men felt nothing but resignation and sorrow. They weren't surprised, panicked, or afraid, because they already knew exactly what had happened. Everybody in town knew the kind of violence Carl Pruitt was capable of. This is why most people in town would never have set foot on the piece of land where Arthur had gone, and why they would definitely never have vandalized something that belonged to Carl. And this was because of the horrific chain of events that began back in 1938, a few years before Arthur made his fateful trip up the hill. Back in 1938, late one afternoon, Carl Pruitt had finished a hard day's work in town as a carpenter and headed home. Like most people in this small town, Carl knew pretty much everybody and seemed to get along well with his friends and neighbors. Most days, he worked hard building and repairing things for other people, and then when he got home, he would often find his wife cooking dinner for both of them. But today, when Carl arrived home, he didn't smell anything cooking, and he didn't see his wife in the kitchen. Instead, he heard a strange noise coming from his bedroom at the back of the house. He ran there to make sure his wife was okay, but when he stepped into the room, he found his wife in bed with another man. Carl began to scream, and the other man leapt out of the bed, climbed through the window, and fled across town. As for Carl's wife, she just stayed in the bed, covering herself with a blanket and trying to apologize to her husband and trying to get him to calm down. But Carl, filled with rage, grabbed a metal chain he used on his job, leapt on top of his wife, wrapped the chain around her throat, and strangled her to death. After the murder of his wife, no one in town ever heard from Carl again. Even though there had never been an arrest or trial, the townspeople were glad Carl was gone. They tried to quickly put this horrific event behind them and basically stopped thinking about Carl Pruitt. However, within months of this murder, a series of violent deaths began taking place in town, and most people did not think these deaths were accidents. The first death that caught people's attention involved a young man who had been seen happily riding his bicycle towards the dirt road that led to the top of the hill. But later that day, someone found the boy back in town lying dead on the street, strangled with his own bike chain. Days later, after the boy had been buried, neighbors found his mother dead in her own yard. She also had been strangled, but with a clothesline, while she was out hanging up laundry. These two deaths put the whole town on edge. Even though nobody had seen him, many people suspected that Carl Pruitt must have come back because the boy and his mother had been strangled to death, just like Carl's wife had been. And not long after that, a farmer turned up, strangled with the reins from his own horse-drawn wagon, which prompted a police investigation. However, before he could finish it, that police officer was strangled to death as well, found in an open field with a large chain wrapped around his neck, looking like it had almost decapitated him. After the death of this police officer, combined with all the other strange strangulation deaths, the town had had it, they were terrified, and they went into full panic mode. Soon, stories began to surface that people had seen Carl wandering through the shadows on this small patch of land he owned on the top of the hill, just waiting for his next victim. And now, Carl appeared to have found his next victim. Arthur Lewis, the man who said he wasn't afraid of Carl, who had traveled up the hill with his hammer and chisel. On top of the hill, the officer and the two men who'd found Arthur's body stood at the gate. The officer told the men to step back and wait over there. Once they had, he opened the gate, walked through, and stepped directly over Arthur's body. He made his way through the grass and found Arthur's hammer and chisel on the ground. And right next to them was the engraved marker that Arthur had come out to deface. However, when the officer shined his light on the marker had no damage to it whatsoever. It was completely intact. Not a single piece of the stone had been chipped off by the chisel. The officer crouched down and moved his light over the stone, and he saw very clearly that on this stone were the words Carl Pruitt, and next to it were dates, the date Carl was born and the date Carl died. Because this stone marker that Arthur had come up here to deface was actually Carl's gravestone. Because Carl had died back in 1938 on the day he found his wife in bed with another man. It would turn out Carl Pruitt not only killed his own wife, but also after seeing what he had done, seeing her dead body, he grabbed a pistol, put it to his head, and fired, taking his own life. Soon after the murder-suicide, Carl's wife was laid to rest in the cemetery near her church, but her family demanded that Carl be buried somewhere else. And so Carl was buried in an isolated grave in an old cemetery at the top of that hill. And of course, since the man was dead, everybody in town assumed he was gone for good, and they would never have to deal with Carl again. But that all changed not long after Carl was buried, when people in town reported seeing strange shadows around his gravesite. And these shadows always took on the same form: a large chain like the one Carl had used to murder his wife. The story spread, and soon a morbid curiosity about Carl's grave arose in town. And that's around the same time that the other strangling deaths began, and when people started to claim that maybe Carl's ghost was responsible for them. But being strangled was not the only thing that connected all these victims. It would turn out, not long before their deaths, they had all tried to vandalize Carl Pruitt's grave. Some had done it on a dare, others did it out of anger. As for the police officer who eventually launched this investigation following all these strangling deaths, well, he didn't vandalize Carl Pruitt's grave, but he was so intrigued by the idea that Carl's ghost could be responsible that he went to the gravesite and began taking photographs. And it was not long after that that he died. As for Arthur, he did attempt to vandalize the grave, but he was not doing it out of anger or some vendetta against Carl or a dare. He was actually doing it to prove to the rest of the townspeople that there was no such thing as ghosts, and that Carl Pruitt was dead and could no longer hurt anyone. However, the instant Arthur began to deface that headstone, someone or something strangled him to death, and many people believe it was Carl Pruitt's ghost. And despite all those attempts at defacing Carl Pruitt's headstone, that headstone was always found, at least according to local legend, in perfect condition. Following the discovery of Arthur's body, people in town really began to fear Carl Pruitt's ghost and his cursed headstone, and they demanded that the cemetery on the hill be closed. And so family members with loved ones buried up there had their bodies removed and reburied in other cemeteries. However, nobody dared touch Carl's grave. So Carl's body remained in that cemetery, until 1958, so 20 years after he'd killed his wife and taken his own life. At that time, in 1958, a strip mining company dug up the ground on the hill, destroying Carl's body and his headstone, and so the curse was said to have finally been lifted. And so, if these two stories tell us anything, it's that if you think you can go searching for ghosts without consequences, you can't.
In 2015, Clyde, Ohio was one of the safest places to live in the entire United States. Basically, violent crime never happened there. So, on April 10th of that year, when a resident was reported missing in the morning, and then their car was spotted just a few hours later in an apartment parking lot, before the police even drove out to the vehicle, they already knew that they would find this missing person either sleeping in their car, or maybe visiting one of their friends in the nearby apartments. However, they would be very wrong, and to this day, the contents of that missing person's car still haunt Clyde, Ohio. 28-year-old Heather Bogle had just been through a couple of really hard weeks, and now, as the single mother looked up at the huge factory where she was about to spend the entire night building washing machines, she still just could not put the events of the past month out of her mind. It was April 9th, 2015, and Heather was standing next to her old car out in the parking lot of the largest employer in the tiny town of Clyde, Ohio, population 6,000. Directly in front of her was the entryway into Whirlpool Incorporated, a sprawling white metal and brick complex with a total workforce of 3,500 people. And once Heather clicked her way through that metal turnstile and entered the factory, she'd be walking out of the cool, clear, quiet evening darkness into an echo chamber the size of more than 30 football fields, all filled with sound and light and people wearing green foam earplugs and safety glasses. Heather had been working the night shift here for 2 years, and the steady paycheck and health benefits she received had made it possible for her and her 6-year-old daughter, Mackenzie, to afford a pretty good life in the town of Fremont, 9 miles north of Clyde. But, important as this job was to Heather, the young mom did not plan to spend the rest of her life working on a production line. Over the last few years, Heather had split her daylight hours between taking care of Mackenzie, catching up on sleep, and also going to school so she could achieve her real ambition, which was to become a licensed practical nurse. Now, Heather forced herself not to look down at her phone and reread the horrible text messages her older half-brother had sent her when Heather had recently gotten word that she'd failed one of her Ohio State Board nursing exams. But the real problem was, Heather didn't have to read those texts to hear them bouncing around in her head. Joshua had called her a dumb hoe who was too stupid to pass the licensed practical nurse exam. He'd signed off by accusing her of having low expectations and then describing her as, quote, typical trash like her mom and dad, end quote. And almost as bad as the pain those words caused was the fact that Heather had just broken up with the one person she could have turned to in this kind of situation for support and comfort. That person was Heather's ex-girlfriend, Carmela Badia. Carmela had been Heather's first relationship with a woman, and their 2-year-long romance had been intense for both of them. Before Carmela, Heather's longest relationship had been with Mackenzie's dad. Heather and Richard had met when Heather was 18, and even though they had never married, the two had moved in together right away and then ended their relationship 5 years later. Unlike Heather's breakup with Carmela, Heather's split from Richard had been a mutual decision. There wasn't much drama, Heather wanted to be free, and so did Richard. After that, when Heather and Mackenzie had moved to their house in Fremont, Heather was so busy and so focused on school and her daughter that she wasn't actively looking to date anyone. And when Heather first met Carmela at Whirlpool, Heather thought of Carmela only as someone she hit it off with and whose day shift overlapped just enough with Heather's night shift that the two of them would eventually strike up a friendship. But right from the start, Carmela had been open about her crush on Heather. At first, Heather had laughed about Carmela's good-natured flirting, but over the course of a few months, Heather's feelings for Carmela had deepened. But the stress of working opposite shifts and the differences in their personalities, along with mutual feelings of jealousy, ultimately took their toll. And in March, less than 1 month earlier, the relationship had ended in a storm of arguments, accusations, and bitter phone calls and text messages. Just the day before, Heather and Carmela had had one of their worst arguments yet, and Carmela had written Heather a long, angry letter that was now sitting in the front passenger seat of Heather's 2003 Oldsmobile Alero car. As Heather locked up her dark green sedan before taking her first step towards the blue awning that read Whirlpool, Clyde Operations, Carmela's words also sounded inside of Heather's head. "You duped me," Carmela had scrawled in ballpoint pen on the small-lined pages. "You have no idea how bad you hurt me. You're dead to me." A few minutes later, as Heather pushed her way through the metal roundabout before walking into the factory, all she could hope was that the next 8 hours would be so loud and distracting that the only thing she'd hear was the sound of metal and plastic appliance parts snapping into place. As a materials handler, Heather's own job took her to various parts of the factory. Using small vehicles called forklifts and tuggers, she was tasked with driving through the miles of factory space, collecting parts, and then delivering those parts to her fellow workers on the assembly line. But even in a workplace where 30 miles of conveyors clanked and rattled overhead, and where workers had to pay attention to what they were doing, Heather's friends on the production line they all shared couldn't help but notice that instead of her usual smile, Heather looked upset. And as Heather shoved the foam plugs into her ears and slipped on her safety glasses before stepping in behind the wheel of her tugger, she saw the looks of concern aimed in her direction. Checking over her shoulder to make sure that the little tow cart behind her tugger was securely attached before starting up the vehicle's engine, Heather found her spirits lifting just a little. She might not be able to confide about her recent disappointments to Carmela, but she reminded herself that she still had plenty of friends at work. People who were rooting for her to pick herself back up, to take that nursing exam again, and not give up on her dream of a better life for herself and Mackenzie. And between conversations with her friends over the course of the night, Heather didn't have to reply to any text message or incoming phone calls unless she felt like it. All the important parts of her day were already totally planned out, and everyone who played a part in her daily routine already knew exactly where and when they could find Heather if they really needed to. And it had been that way for more than a year. Heather's shift always ended just after 6 in the morning, and after clocking out, Heather would call Mackenzie's babysitter before Mackenzie headed off to school. Then Heather would head for her home in Fremont to sleep until it was time to collect Mackenzie at the end of the school day. After that, Heather could enjoy spending the afternoon and evening with her daughter before dropping Mackenzie back off with the sitter and leaving for work just before 10 p.m. Even now, when Heather was feeling down, just the thought of her daughter made her smile. Tomorrow's forecast called for cool weather and wind, but it was also supposed to be nice and sunny, and so if Heather made sure to bring along an extra warm jacket for Mackenzie to wear after school, the two of them could spend some time outside on the playground. Being out with Mackenzie was usually the best part of Heather's day, and Heather liked knowing that when people saw the two of them together, there was no mistaking them for anything other than mother and child. With her blonde hair and big smile, Mackenzie looked like a younger version of her slender mom, with the brown eyes, shoulder-length hair, and a scattering of freckles across a tan face. By the time Heather had begun her first circuit of the bright warehouse that night, the third shift had settled in for that night's work. Over the next 24 hours, the Whirlpool factory would turn out a total of 20,000 washing machines. And tonight, as Heather waved to her coworkers, being one of the team that produced those washing machines made her feel better. She might not be here for the next 30 years, but she knew she was lucky to have this job and have coworkers whose lives were a lot like her own. Other parents raising kids just like she was, people with worries just like she had. And by the time morning rolled around and Heather was throwing away her foam earplugs and pulling off her safety glasses, her usual smile was back on her face. Chatting with coworkers over the last 8 hours had been good. These sympathetic responses she had gotten had helped put Heather back into her naturally optimistic state of mind. She knew that once she saved up enough money to take the state nursing exam again, she would make sure that she passed it. Now, as Heather looked up at the clock and shook her hair out of its ponytail, the disappointments and hurts of the last few days didn't seem nearly as crushing to her as they had the night before. She knew her mom had sent her at least a few text messages, but Heather decided she would answer those later. For now, she had one more thing she had to do before she went home to sleep, and it shouldn't take long. Heather would wait to call her mom and babysitter once she had arrived back at her house in Fremont. A few minutes later, and Heather was pushing through the metal turnstile under the blue whirlpool awning, hands in her pockets and head down, as she stepped out into the parking lot and headed for her car. It wasn't until 2:33 p.m. that afternoon, 8.5 hours after Heather's night shift had ended, that Heather's mother really started to get worried. That's when Renee McLaughlin sent yet another text to her daughter, asking if Heather was still planning to pick up Mackenzie after school. Renee might not even have bothered to send this text, since Heather always picked her daughter up after school, but earlier messages that Renee had sent to Heather while Heather was at work had all gone unanswered, and that wasn't like her daughter. Now, as Renee looked at her phone, waiting for Heather to text her back, Renee had to make a conscious effort to relax. Renee was still checking for Heather's reply when Renee got a phone call from another one of her daughters, Heather's younger sister, Jen. And as Renee listened to Jen explain what was going on, the worry Renee had been feeling tightened into a huge knot of fear. Now she knew for sure something was very, very wrong. It turned out that Jen, who was listed as Heather's emergency contact, had just been notified by Mackenzie's school that Heather had never arrived that afternoon to pick Mackenzie up. Jen also discovered that in another break from Heather's usual routine, Heather had not called Mackenzie's babysitter that morning before the babysitter had taken Mackenzie into school. After filling her mom in on the situation, Jen had hopped into her car and headed for Mackenzie's school. On her way, Jen used the short trip to call Heather's friends to see if any of them had heard from Heather that day. Meanwhile, Renee got on her phone and began calling other family members, including one of Heather's cousins who also worked at Whirlpool, to see if any of them had seen or heard from Heather. As soon as Jen had returned from school and dropped Mackenzie off with Renee, Jen and one of Heather's best friends began their own search for Heather. They printed out flyers with Heather's picture on them to put on telephone poles. They jumped on Facebook and other social media sites to spread the word about Heather's disappearance. Then the two women drove and walked around Fremont and Clyde, splitting up so they could cover more ground, stopping at Heather's grandfather's house before hitting every store or park or playground that Heather liked to visit. They also called hospitals, tow truck companies, and more friends. By 5:30 p.m., after arranging care for Mackenzie, Renee walked into the Sandusky County Sheriff's Department 30 miles northeast of Fremont and filed a missing person report on her daughter. The violent crime rate in Clyde, Ohio is among the lowest in the state, so any circumstance in which someone's life might be in danger was taken seriously right away. There was no 24-hour grace period or anything like that. Instead, it was instant action. And after hearing the pure panic in Renee's description of how out of character it would be for Heather not to pick up her daughter after school, the situation seemed unusual and suspicious enough that the sheriff's department acted immediately. Even as Jen and her friend were crisscrossing town searching for Heather, the sheriff's office issued an alert to local hospitals and other law enforcement agencies, as well as to the local news media. And before long, officers were driving over to the Whirlpool factory parking lot and surrounding area to search for Heather's car. The deputies also stopped at local bars and went to the home in a nearby trailer park to talk with Heather's ex and Mackenzie's dad, Richard. But it wasn't until 8 p.m. that evening, 40 minutes before darkness fell, that police got their first real news on the whereabouts of Heather Bogle. Without giving her name, a woman called police to report that she'd seen a car matching the description of Heather's older model dark green Oldsmobile sedan. And when police ran the license number that the caller gave them, they knew they had a match. A few minutes later, the first deputy on the scene called back to headquarters. He'd found the car where the caller had said it would be. It was in a parking lot that belonged to the Somerton Apartments on Hickory Street in Clyde, just a 5-minute drive from the Whirlpool factory where Heather worked. But any hope police had that they would find Heather asleep inside of her car or inside one of the apartments visiting a friend quickly vanished. The car was empty except for a black and white striped knapsack and what looked like a personal letter, both sitting on the front passenger seat. And when the deputy forced open the trunk of Heather's car, disappointment and worry suddenly turned to shock and horror. Inside the trunk was the body of a young woman. She lay curled on her side, dressed in jeans, pink and white sneakers, and an oversized red Mickey Mouse t-shirt that hid the 2 bullet holes in the back of her chest. The victim's knees were drawn up to her chest and her hands were tucked under her chin. Even in the small beam of the flashlight, the deputy could see that this woman had also been savagely beaten. There was also no doubt that she was dead. And it wasn't just the injuries to nearly every visible inch of her body that shocked the veteran police officer. It was the fact that her hair had been crudely hacked off in chunks right down to her scalp. And as the deputy moved the light so it shined down on her hands and face, he saw that her fingernails had also been cut brutally short, right down to the soft flesh of the nail bed. Even before the family identified the body, the Sandusky Sheriff's Department knew that they had just found Heather Bogle. By the time Detective Sean O'Connell arrived at the Somerton apartment complex, the area around Heather's car had been marked off as a crime scene. The red paint on the front side panel of Heather's Oldsmobile, the result of bodywork to the car, was the only color picked up by the portable floodlights. But the detective, a veteran law enforcement officer with more than 20 years of service, hardly registered the yellow crime scene tape or the sounds and lights of emergency vehicles that were now starting to pour into the 230 block of Hickory Street. Staring down into the trunk of the car and slowly taking in the sight of what had been done to Heather's hair and nails, as well as to her body, the investigators' first thought was this murder was personal. Whoever had beaten Heather and then chopped off her hair must have been acting out of rage. The detective had already been told about a breakup letter from Heather's ex-girlfriend, Carmela, that had been left sitting on the front seat of Heather's car, and even without reading it, Detective O'Connell knew that Carmela was already high up on his list of people of interest. But at the same time, this looked like a crime of passion. There were also obvious signs that the killer had gone to great lengths to erase any evidence that might help police in this homicide investigation. Even before Heather's body was carefully removed from the floor of the trunk and taken to the county morgue for an autopsy to determine exact cause of death and to collect additional physical evidence, there was no visible sign that this car was the place where Heather had actually been murdered. There was no sign of a struggle, there was no sign of a weapon or bullet shell casings, and inside the well of the trunk, the jumper cables, a single white flip-flop, a spare pair of shoes, and a tangle of bungee cords next to a white plastic shopping bag from a Walmart store all appeared undisturbed. Instead, it looked to Detective O'Connell like Heather must have been murdered somewhere else and then dumped here. That way, police would not have an actual murder scene to investigate. There were other signs that the murderer had taken pains to cover their tracks. The neon green top that Heather had been reported wearing when she went missing had been replaced by the extra-large red Mickey Mouse shirt. The defensive wounds on Heather's hands, arms, and face all told police that Heather had fought back hard against her attacker, so the killer had cut her nails and her hair in an effort to remove any trace of the killer's DNA that may have transferred to Heather's body in the course of that struggle. After that, it looked like the killer had arranged Heather's body into this fetal position inside the trunk of her car before leaving the vehicle and Heather's body in this poorly lit parking lot outside the cheaply built 2-story apartment complex. Crime scene techs would later confirm Detective O'Connell's initial impression of the crime scene. Despite a careful examination of the trunk interior, they found no usable forensic evidence. And a later autopsy report would estimate that Heather had been murdered much earlier in the day, probably within a few hours of the Whirlpool video surveillance tape that would show Heather leaving the Whirlpool factory at 6:17 a.m. that morning of Friday, April 10th. That same autopsy would also reveal that Heather had ultimately been killed by 2 gunshot wounds to her back. But in a huge break for law enforcement, despite the killer's effort to erase any connection to the crime, the medical examiner would find small amounts of what police assumed was the killer's DNA buried under what little remained of Heather's fingernails. When Detective O'Connell finally looked up from his own visual inspection of Heather's body curled up in the trunk of her car, he noticed one of the residents of the 48-unit complex in front of him standing outside her apartment door, watching the police do their work. That person was 24-year-old Kiona Boer, an African-American woman raising 2 children on her own, who had already had at least one run-in with the Sandusky Sheriff's Department's all-white detective bureau. After making sure the crime scene had been properly secured and processed, Detective O'Connell gave orders for police to start canvassing the area for information about the driver of the green car. He also set in motion interviews with personnel at Whirlpool, as well as with Heather's family and friends. Meanwhile, after taking a final look down at the police activity in her parking lot, Kiona stepped back into her apartment, then carefully closed and locked the door behind her. Over the next 2 weeks, Detective O'Connell reported to the local media and to Heather's family that the Sheriff's Department was making good progress on their investigation into Heather's murder. While he was not ready to make any arrests, the lead detective said investigators had ruled out several key suspects who had close ties to Heather. Although she was among the first to be interviewed as a person of interest, Detective O'Connell quickly checked Carmela Badia off his suspect list. As far as he was concerned, Carmela, who had clocked into the Whirlpool factory for her day shift just half an hour after Heather was seen leaving the factory, just didn't have enough time to commit this murder. He also did not believe Carmela would have tried to cover her tracks, but still leave that breakup letter she had written to Heather in the front seat of Heather's car. Also in the clear were Heather's ex-boyfriend, Richard, and Heather's older brother, Joshua. In addition to having an alibi for the time of the murder, Joshua explained to police that the degrading texts he had sent his half-sister shortly before her death were just his way of motivating Heather to do better on her nursing boards next time she took them. He described his insults as being, quote, tough love. But almost from the start of the investigation into Heather's death, it would turn out that Detective O'Connell had formed a theory of the crime that would lead him from one dead end to another. When toxicology tests on Heather's body eventually revealed a small amount of marijuana in her bloodstream, Detective O'Connell became totally convinced that Heather's murder was drug-related, and that Heather's murderer or murderers were all connected to the young African-American woman who had stood outside of her apartment watching police work the crime scene on the night of April 10th, when Heather's body was first discovered. Detective O'Connell's suspicions were based on his theory that Heather had driven to the apartment complex after work in order to purchase drugs. And years earlier, Detective O'Connell had arrested the father of one of Kiona Boer's children, a man named Omar Satchel, on drug charges. Police had also been informed that before Heather's murder, Kiona had been seen wearing a large-sized red Mickey Mouse shirt that might match the shirt Heather was wearing when her body was discovered, and that there was still a close association between Kiona and Omar. By April 17th, 1 week after Heather was murdered, police had conducted 2 searches of Kiona Boer's unit at the Somerton apartment complex. Police had also arrived in force and with guns drawn at the nursing home where Kiona worked to obtain a DNA sample. Even as other tips and potential leads in the case trickled in to the sheriff's office, Detective O'Connell continued to focus his effort on building a case against Kiona Boer, Omar Satchel, and a third African-American man who the investigators suspected of owning the gun that was used to kill Heather. Meanwhile, Heather's family and friends held a series of vigils in her honor and started raising money that would go to Heather's daughter, Mackenzie. But as the investigation into Heather's death dragged on for more than 12 months without any arrests or hard evidence against Detective O'Connell's chief suspects, Heather's sister, Jen, was not the only person complaining to the media and the sheriff that Detective O'Connell was mishandling the murder investigation. And then, in September 2016, 17 months after Heather's murder, Detective O'Connell announced that he was resigning from the Sandusky Sheriff's Department to take a job as a manager of a McDonald's fast food restaurant. Sean O'Connell's decision came several months after his prime suspects had all broken their silence, not only claiming that they had nothing to do with Heather's murder, but also pointing out that they had never even met Heather and had no personal ties to her whatsoever. To prove their claim, the suspects volunteered tissue and DNA samples, they stated their willingness to take lie detector tests, and pointed to the alibis they had provided police. They also accused the sheriff's department of racial profiling, which is targeting individuals for suspicion of crime based on the individual's race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin. Just before his resignation, Detective O'Connell himself had been placed on 3 months of paid leave, and the murder investigation had been turned over to the Ohio Bureau of Investigation. And at the same time, Kyle Overmeyer, Sandusky's sheriff and Detective O'Connell's boss, admitted to opiate addiction and was charged with stealing prescription drugs from lockboxes at area police stations. Stunned, Heather's family and friends watched as the state stepped in and tried to pick up the pieces of the murder investigation. To them, and to the frightened residents of Clyde and Fremont, it looked like a bungled investigation by a corrupt and possibly racist sheriff's office would result in one of the most vicious murders ever committed in Northwest Ohio turning into a cold case. In November of 2016, 19 months after Heather Bogle's murder, the voters of Sandusky County voted in a brand new sheriff. And when Police Lieutenant Chris Hilton stepped into that office 2 months later, in January of 2017, one of his first moves as sheriff was to appoint a new detective who would be charged with starting the Heather Bogle murder investigation all over again from scratch. And that new detective, Nick Kotsopoulos, did not waste any time following those orders. With 18 years experience in law enforcement, this would be the 11th homicide that Detective Kotsopoulos had investigated. And even though he was basically treating Heather's murder as a cold case, the detective was coming at the homicide from a different direction than former investigator Sean O'Connell. He would follow the hard evidence wherever it took him, but he was also interested in talking with people and potential suspects who had a personal connection to Heather. He also wanted to find out exactly where Heather was killed. And after going through the complete file on Heather's murder, it didn't take long for the new lead investigator to totally rule out Sean O'Connell's top 3 suspects. Not only was there absolutely no physical evidence to connect them to Heather's death, it turned out none of their DNA matched the tissue sample that the medical examiner had found under Heather's nails, an important detail that former Detective O'Connell had left out of his reports on the case. Those DNA results would also rule out, once and for all, Heather's ex-girlfriend, Carmela, and Heather's half-brother, Joshua. Once he had cleared all the past suspects in Heather's murder, the new investigator went back through the tips that former Detective O'Connell had received from Heather's coworkers, but never followed up on. The investigator also found several search warrants related to collecting possible evidence in Heather's death that former Detective O'Connell had not executed. Those warrants included one that allowed the investigator access to Heather's computer and to all the location data collected from Heather's devices, including her phone, that was collected and stored in her various Google applications. Designed by the technology giant Google, those applications included Heather's email account, as well as a social connection program called Google Hangouts that allowed the user to send their GPS location to their contacts. In order to do that, Google Hangouts used Heather's phone to track her real-life location. Heather's records showed that the last ping from Heather's cell phone before the battery died came in at 9:20 a.m. on April 10th, 2015, 3 hours after Heather was last seen on that security footage that showed her leaving the Whirlpool parking lot at 6:17 on the morning she disappeared. Using Heather's cell phone records, investigators were able to narrow her whereabouts between 6:17 a.m. and 9:20 a.m., but they could only place her location during those critical hours within a radius of about 5 miles from the cell phone tower. So it wasn't until the investigator overlaid that data with the GPS coordinates of Heather's cell phone that had been collected by her various Google accounts, all of which Heather had left open, that Detective Kotsopoulos finally hit pay dirt. A map of all those GPS coordinates allowed investigators to pinpoint with much greater accuracy the location of Heather's cell phone on the morning that she went missing. On May 26, 2017, just over 2 years after Heather's murder, Detective Kotsopoulos and his investigation team left the Sandusky Sheriff's Department and made the 40 minutes drive south to a place called Emerald Estates Trailer Park, located in Green Creek Township. Their destination was a white trailer located at the bottom point of an important triangle. The home, with the wooden porch built off the side, was located 13 minutes and 6 miles southwest of the Whirlpool factory in Clyde, where Heather had worked, and 9 miles and 17 minutes southeast of Fremont, where Heather had lived with her little daughter Mackenzie. When police arrived at trailer number 79, the resident and owner of the trailer looked surprised to see them, but invited them to come inside. Yes, this person told Detective Kotsopoulos they'd be more than happy to answer any questions about Heather Bogle, even though the person had hardly known her. It wasn't until the owner of trailer number 79 refused to volunteer a DNA sample that Detective Kotsopoulos felt the adrenaline surge through his body. He was suddenly sure that the 25-month-long search for Heather's killer was finally over. Based on evidence that Detective Kotsopoulos and his team would collect over the next few days, here is a reconstruction of what police believe really happened to 28-year-old Heather Bogle after she left work more than 2 years earlier on Friday, April 10th, 2015 at 6:17 in the morning. Heather's killer had an eye for vulnerable women. He also had an eye for attractive women who played up their femininity. He liked painted fingernails, and he liked that Heather had that nose piercing and wore that sparkling stud that brought out her brown eyes. He liked that she didn't eat Doritos with her fingers because she didn't want to get the red seasoning from the corn chips all over her hands. But on the night of April 9th, when Heather arrived at work without her usual smile and with stress written all over her face, what Heather's killer liked most of all was the fact that Heather was so obviously upset. And when their paths crossed at work that night on the manufacturing line, as they had every night for more than a year, Heather's killer made it a point to find out exactly what was bothering his popular and trusting young coworker. Over the next 8 hours, Heather's killer gathered up each crumb of information, receiving each one with a look of sympathy: how Heather had failed one of her nursing exams, how her own brother had just sent her text messages calling her too stupid to pass, how she would have to go back to studying for the tests all over again and save up the hundreds of dollars it would cost her to retake the state exams. And by the time Heather's night shift was over, Heather's killer had persuaded her to stop by his house after work. He was pretty sure he had some books on human anatomy and biology that might help with Heather's next round of study. He told her where he lived and how easy it was to get there. So, after leaving the Whirlpool factory parking lot at 6:17 a.m., Heather hopped into her dark green car with the bright red front side panel and began the short drive to Emerald Estates Trailer Park. There was no need to call her mom or babysitter. Heather expected this visit would be a short one, and if it delayed her at all, it would only be for a few minutes. She could return her mom's text messages and call the sitter on her drive back to Fremont. When Heather pulled up outside of the white trailer marked number 79, Heather saw her coworker's car in the driveway. So, after parking her Alero, she hopped out and walked up the 4 wooden steps leading to the covered porch and knocked on the front door of the trailer.
Heather only had to wait a second before the door was open, and with a smile of thanks, Heather stepped inside. As soon as the killer had closed the door behind his visitor, he didn't waste any time on any more conversation with Heather about her recent setbacks. He also did not have any study guides that would help her pass her next round of exams. Instead of collecting nursing textbooks, Heather's killer was a man who had spent a lot of time building a home video library that showcased his taste for violent sex and for non-consensual bondage and domination. And what he wanted now, very badly, was to have sex with Heather. But instead of accepting his advances, welcoming the way he leaned into her, getting too close and reaching out to pull her towards him, Heather was confused and repelled, saying no to his advances and then pushing him away. The man in front of her was 46 years old. That was 18 years older than she was, and Heather's last relationship had been with a woman. But even as the creepiness and then danger of the situation fully registered with Heather, it was too late. Because now, the man in front of her was both enraged and excited by Heather's rejection. In that moment, the killer's need to have sex with Heather, an act that might leave traces of his DNA inside of her, had changed to something else, an overwhelming desire to control and punish her. But Heather was a fighter, and despite the fact that she was hopelessly outweighed and overpowered by her much larger and stronger attacker, Heather responded to the assault by hitting her killer so hard that she broke one of his teeth and cracked another. But over the course of that morning, Heather would pay for her bravery. The autopsy on her body that would be performed the next day would include a long catalog of injuries to all parts of Heather's body. Ligature marks on her wrists and ankles showed that she had been tied up. There were also curved red lines on the left side of her neck where she may have been whipped with a cord or had the cord wrapped around her throat. Heather's face, jaw, eyelids, forehead, and legs were covered with bruises, and even her tongue showed signs of bite marks and lacerations. Her hands and arms were dotted with round red defensive wounds caused by blunt trauma. And when the killer was finished with his savage torture and beating, he left her on the floor and then came back with his .380 Cobra small caliber handgun and fired 2 shots into Heather's back, injuries that collapsed her lungs and caused almost immediate death. But even though Heather's resistance had enraged her killer, it was that decision to fight for her life that would eventually help police identify her killer. Before arranging Heather's lifeless body in the trunk of her green car, the killer pulled off her green neon top and replaced it with an extra-large red Mickey Mouse t-shirt. And then, in what police believe was an effort to destroy any physical evidence that could tie him to the murder, the killer also hacked Heather's shoulder-length hair off at the roots and cut her fingernails down to the quick. But Heather had fought so hard that traces of her attacker's DNA had been pushed underneath the cuticles that covered the bottom of her fingernails. It would be just enough to give police the tissue sample they would later use to help convict her killer. After abandoning Heather's car, with Heather's body locked in the trunk, at the Somerton apartment complex, the killer sat back to wait and to build his cover of innocence. He made sure that he went to Heather's funeral and signed the guest register, expressing his grief alongside so many of Heather's other co-workers from Whirlpool. He also pulled up and replaced the flooring in his trailer where police believe Heather had been shot and killed. And when Heather's family set up a GoFundMe page for Heather's daughter, Mackenzie, 44-year-old Daniel Myers, a 17-year veteran of Whirlpool who had worked right alongside Heather on the factory's production and material handling lines, made a donation of $125. On that same GoFundMe page, Daniel, who had been arrested on a domestic assault charge in 2001 and another assault charge in 2004, posted this message, quote, "Heather, you were such an amazing person. I am distraught that there will be no more of your smiles at work. You will always be in my thoughts. Your daughter will always be in my prayers. God bless you, little Missy." End quote. It would turn out that on May 26th, when Detective Nick Kotsopoulos and his team headed to trailer number 79 in Emerald Estates Trailer Park, they were following the location coordinates they had found stored in Heather's Google accounts.
It had been an electronic trail, there ever since the day of Heather's murder, that followed the young mother from the Whirlpool factory in Clyde on the morning of April 10th, 2015, to the actual scene of her murder. And during that first interview with Detective Kotsopoulos, when Daniel Myers told police he hardly knew Heather and then refused to volunteer a DNA sample, the investigator knew right away that he had a brand new prime suspect in the murder of Heather Bogle. As for Daniel Myers' broken tooth, he told investigators it was nothing and that he'd fixed it himself using superglue. In the days immediately following that first interview with Daniel Myers at trailer number 79, investigators were able to get a search warrant that compelled him to give police a DNA sample. Police also got a warrant to search his house, where they found guns, videotapes of violent sexual encounters, and under the carpet, new sections of flooring that had been installed within a week of Heather's disappearance. On June 1st, after lab tests matched Daniel's DNA to the tissue found under Heather's cuticles, Daniel Myers was arrested and charged with aggravated first-degree murder, robbery, and kidnapping in the death of Heather Bogle. Immediately after Daniel Myers' arrest, 10 women came forward to report that they had been raped by Daniel Myers. But it would turn out that Daniel Myers would not be the only person in the Heather Bogle homicide investigation who would face criminal charges. On December 13th, 2018, a little over a year after Daniel Myers' arrest, former detective Sean O'Connell was sentenced to 2 years in prison for actions related to his investigation into Heather's murder. Those charges included tampering with and falsifying evidence and sharing confidential murder files with members of the public. It would turn out that former detective O'Connell had pursued his case against Kiona Boer, Omar Satchel, and a third African-American suspect even after he knew that their DNA did not match the DNA found under Heather's fingernails. As a result of being singled out as a murder suspect, Kiona Boer would lose her job and apartment, and she and her school-age son would both become the target of hate and bullying. Former Detective O'Connell was also criticized for delaying justice. Just days after Heather's murder, Sean O'Connell had received an email tip from a woman who worked at Whirlpool telling police she knew of one employee who she believed, based on her own encounters, would be capable of committing murder, and that man's name was Daniel Myers. Detective O'Connell also failed to execute the search warrant he had early on in the Heather Bogle investigation that would have given him access to the Google accounts that had stored a record of Heather's movements from the time she left work on the day of her murder until her phone died 3 hours later. On February 13th, 2019, almost 4 years after Heather's death, Heather's co-worker Daniel Myers pleaded guilty to murder in order to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But before the judge issued that sentence, there was one final twist in a murder case that had generated headlines across the state and that would become the subject of several true crime documentaries. Just days after Daniel Myers was arrested in 2017, investigators reopened an older case involving the death of Myers' ex-girlfriend, 37-year-old Leanne Sluter. Back in 2009, 6 years before the murder of Heather Bogle, Daniel Myers told police he had discovered Leanne lying dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in the bedroom of a trailer he owned. At the time, police did not question Daniel's account or treat the death as suspicious, even though Leanne's family wanted Daniel questioned as a suspect. Ultimately, the new investigation into Leanne's death turned up a suicide note in the victim's handwriting that was provided by Daniel Myers' family. But although the Leanne Sluter investigation ended without another charge of murder, Leanne Sluter's family insist that if police had done a thorough investigation into Leanne's death and questioned Daniel Myers as a suspect back in 2009, Heather Bogle would still be alive today.
At about 2:30 a.m. on August 27, 2010, a 29-year-old man named Christopher Kaiser and his girlfriend Emily held hands and stepped out onto a railroad bridge high above the ground in a remote area of North Carolina. It was totally dark out except for the beams of their flashlights. Christopher and Emily were only 15 minutes away from the big event that they had come out here to witness, and they were nervous and excited. They checked the time, then started walking slowly across the bridge, pausing every few feet to listen for the sound of a train rumbling toward them. But all they could hear was whispering and giggling and the occasional shout coming from the 10 other people who had all hiked out here as well to wait alongside them, and who were now just standing in clusters all along the bridge. So usually, this railroad bridge, which was called the Boston Bridge, was not a place that people went to. First of all, it was technically trespassing to be there, but beyond that, the bridge was way out in the woods and required a rocky hike to get to. And once you did get to it, there really wasn't much to see. The bridge itself was pretty basic as bridges go. It had been built in the 1850s out of brick and stone, with big arches underneath, and it crossed a ravine that was about 100 feet deep. Train tracks ran the entire length of the bridge, which was about 300 feet. On either end, the tracks disappeared into the forest. And so the Boston Bridge was just a kind of boring, typical railroad bridge with no people on it, except one night a year. And that night was tonight, because tonight the Boston Bridge was supposed to be haunted. Exactly 119 years earlier, on August 27, 1891, a passenger train had somehow lost control while crossing this bridge, and it careened off the side, plunging into the ravine below. The accident had killed 23 people. Now, Christopher and Emily knew that regular trains had not used this bridge in a long time. But ever since the accident, legend had it that if you went to the bridge on the anniversary of that crash, at the exact moment the train went off the side, apparently a ghost train would appear, speeding along the tracks and blasting its horn. People said you could actually hear the horrible screeching sound of the brakes as they tried and failed to keep the train on the tracks, and then you could hear the screaming of the passengers as they plunged to their deaths all over again. This ghost train passing through was the big event that Christopher and Emily and everybody else had come out to see. Tonight, they were all ghost hunters. Just then, one of the people at the bridge checked the time and called out that there was only 1 minute left to go till the ghost train arrived. And with this, all the whispering and laughing and yelling stopped. Everyone on the bridge fell silent and waited. Out on the tracks, Christopher and Emily looked at each other and squeezed each other's hands. The couple was deeply in love and considered each other soulmates. And one of the best things about their relationship was the sense of adventure they both shared. And tonight was exactly the kind of adrenaline-pumping thing they both loved doing together. And so as the clock ticked down, the couple turned to watch the tracks where they emerged from the woods in the direction they knew the ghost train was supposed to come from. And as they did this, they actually began to feel the bridge tremble under their feet. And at the same time, they heard a few people start shouting with excitement. It was really happening. From the woods came a low rumbling sound that quickly turned into a roar. And for a second, Christopher and Emily couldn't believe it. Of course, they wanted to see the ghost train. That's why they were there. But they hadn't truly been convinced this ghost train was actually real. But now, as they watched, a bright light emerged from the woods and flooded the bridge. The ghost train was almost right on top of them. Suddenly, the train blasted its horn, and then Christopher and Emily heard the screeching of the brakes, just like the legend said they would. But this was not fun and spooky. This was actually terrifying. The other ghost hunters on the bridge started screaming and running, and so did Christopher and Emily. But suddenly, Christopher just stopped running and turned to Emily, and he looked her in the eyes and told her, "I love you." And then Christopher pushed Emily off the bridge. Not long afterwards, police and paramedics flooded the woods around Bastion Bridge and the ravine beneath it. A helicopter circled overhead, shining a bright light down to help them search. And it didn't take long before one of the policemen working his way down the slope that led to the ravine stopped cold and called out for help. He had found Emily. She was badly injured and barely able to move, but she was alive. The police officer looked up at the bridge over his head. He figured she must have fallen 30 feet or so. It was incredible that she had not died. As paramedics strapped Emily into a neck brace to get her safely on a stretcher, another police officer down in the bottom of the ravine shouted that he needed backup now. That officer had found Christopher. It would take some time, but the first responders would eventually piece together what had happened on the Bastion Bridge in the early hours of August 27, 2010. At around 2:45 a.m., members of the ghost hunting group waiting on the bridge had begun to cheer. They saw a bright light approaching the bridge, and they knew this meant the ghost train had arrived. But just seconds later, those cheers turned into screams. Christopher saw everybody else scattering to get away from the bridge, and suddenly he knew exactly what was happening. Passenger trains hadn't used these tracks in decades, but freight trains still did. And by some bizarre chance, one of those freight trains came barreling onto the bridge at the exact time when everybody thought the ghost train would appear. On that freight train, the conductor frantically blew the horn and tried to bring the train to a stop. But Christopher could tell the train was going too fast, and there was no way it could stop in time. And so Christopher and Emily, they started running away from the train down the bridge like the others were, but Christopher saw Emily was lagging behind. And Christopher knew he might be able to outrun this train and get off in time, but from the looks of it, Emily, the love of his life, was not going to be able to do that. And so Christopher made a terrible decision. He took a quick look down to make sure his desperate plan made sense. Then he stopped running, waiting for Emily to catch up with him. He looked her in the eyes, told her he loved her, and then he pushed her off the bridge. Christopher could see that where they were standing was only about 30 feet above the ravine, not 100. And so he figured by pushing her off the bridge, she had a better chance of surviving a 30-foot fall than of being hit by a speeding freight train. However, what Christopher must have understood was that by waiting for Emily and pushing her off to try to save her life, it would not leave him enough time to save his own life. And he was right. Almost instantly after he saved his girlfriend's life, the freight train struck him and threw him off the bridge. When the police officer found Christopher a short while later, he was already deceased. As for Emily, she was airlifted to a nearby hospital, and she eventually recovered from her injuries. And so Christopher is remembered as a hero.